Hey there, it's me, YouTube Art Lady, the one from the internet. And today my mullet and I are going to be eating celery and lentil dip and bringing you all a shading tutorial. Last year I made this big boy digital art tutorial on my full digital art process, which a lot of you seem to really enjoy. So this year, by popular request, I'm going to be diving a bit deeper into individual topics like backgrounds, painting, skin, and shading to try to explain my process even more. I've got to say, not a lot of digital art tutorials tell you why things work the way they do. They just tell you, you put the highlight on the hair here, you put the shadow under the jawline here, which really confused me as a younger artist. I especially want to touch on why things are done a certain way in illustration and how having a basic understanding of principles like light, composition, and color theory can really help to improve your work. Now, this is definitely a big video to tackle, so I'd like to give a huge thank you to Clip Studio Paint for returning to sponsor this video. They sponsored my previous tutorial, so if you'd like to show them some love, I encourage you to try out the Clip Studio Paint free trial and consider purchasing the software. You can find the download link for that in my description. It's my main art program. I've used it for years for basically all my illustrations, and I highly recommend it. So, to get into today's topic, I am not an expert. I'm just a person who's been drawing for like 10-ish years, and I'm certainly not an expert in like light physics or whatever. So this video is really just intended to share my methods with you and give you some insight into light and shadow if you've never really thought about it before, so that you can begin improving. Hi there. Wanna laugh? For more in-depth information, I highly recommend the following people. Their videos would make an excellent follow-up to this one, and you can find the links to those in my description. Hi. Okay. So let's talk a bit real quick about what shading actually is. Shading is just a stylized visual representation of light. Done. Video over. But for the purposes of digital art, people use a lot of methods like hard cell shading, soft cell shading, and painterly shading, and there's like a whole bunch more, but these are just some blanket terms for us to use here today. Hard cell shading is just hard edges everywhere, no feathering. Soft cell shading is basically the opposite, all soft edges everywhere, no hard edges. But I'd say what a lot of people are using right now would be considered painterly shading, or this style. It's a mix between the two of them, and I would say it's most accurate to how light actually works. It's based around shadows and forms having a hard edge and then a soft or feathered edge. This is a big principle in painting, which is why it's called painterly shading. I feel like a lot of people are moving away from the more deviant art methods that I mentioned earlier and are moving more towards stylized realism. It's also the method that I tend to use, so it's what I'm going to be focusing on here today. First up, let's touch a bit on how light and shadows behave in the real world in some relatively simple terms. Light travels in tiny particles called photons in the path of a ray. When light is cast by any source, it travels in a straight line or ray until its path is interrupted by a surface reflecting, refracting, or scattering the ray, causing it to change its angle and travel in a straight line on a different path. Smooth surfaces like mirrors tend to reflect light, while rougher surfaces like a rock or piece of paper have lots of little surface imperfections, which cause the light to scatter in a bunch of different directions. Refraction occurs when light passes through two transparent mediums such as air or water, causing light rays to change speed and essentially bend. You can see this happen when light rays refract through a clear glass of water or the surface of a pool. Color is another important piece of the conversation when we're talking about light. I've made a whole video about it here, although it's kind of old and has some imperfect information. But to do a short overview here, color is the result of the visible light spectrum. When light rays hit a surface, some wavelengths of light are absorbed and the remaining wavelengths are reflected back into our eyeballs, causing us to perceive the object as the color it reflects. Color is really just light, so the colors in your scene will be affected by the intensity and temperature of your light source. If there's low light, your colors will have darker values and less saturation. If the light is bright and intense, you'll likely have higher contrast, brighter values, and higher saturation. We're going to talk a bit about how color factors into shading and lighting later on, but first, what can all this tell us about light in illustration? Well, for example, say you have one light source cast on your subject. It wraps around the subject, some areas obscure the light, and others cast a shadow, right? Well, light and shadows aren't quite that simple.
Because as we discussed earlier, light reflects, refracts, scatters,
It does a bunch of this other lame stuff.
So if we're talking about the sun as a light source on your subject, you'll have one direct light source, but your subject will also be affected by the light in the environment.
Whenever objects reflect or scatter light, those light rays bounce all around your environment, oftentimes reflecting back up into the shadows of your subject. We digital artists call this bounce light. There's also a bunch of other names for it, but that's the one that I like to use because it's the most self-explanatory.
So instead of your light and shadows looking something like this, you end up with lighting that looks a bit more like this.
So basically, when shading a scene, the types of light that you'll need to worry about are direct light.
Light cast directly on your subject from the light source or sources. It's going to be the brightest, strongest source of light and cause the highest contrast shadow.
And bounce light, or ambient light,
which is light cast back onto your subject from the environment, mostly affecting the shadows. However, bounce light or ambient light is much more subtle because every time a light ray bounces, it gets much weaker.
Something that is essential for making lighting on skin look nice and realistic is a little thing called subsurface scattering.
Some surfaces absorb light, but then refract and scatter the light inside the surface. This happens notably with skin. Put a flashlight under your fingers or observe how someone's nose or ears appear bright orange in strong sunlight. These are both examples of light scattering under the surface of your skin. For those of you who are well versed in science, forgive me for any inaccuracies here, but I think this explanation will suffice for us digital artists who just want to paint some anime fan art. I don't know.
So, multiple light sources. Multiple light sources can get a little bit tricky in digital illustration, and I'll get to a live example in a little bit. One of the techniques that I like to use when dealing with this is edge light or rim light. Edge light and rim light is basically when your character is backlit and bits of light are wrapping around the edge of the subject to illuminate them. Sort of like this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and all of these. I use edge light a lot in my art. This is really great for making a character stand out against like a dark background or just adding like a whole lot of mystery and drama to the shot. I mean, do you see this? Dramatic.
This is also great for multiple light sources because you can show different colors and types of light clearly affecting your subject without worrying about weird muddy shadows in different directions. You'll see me use this a lot in a little bit, but for right now, I know this was a lot of very sciencey information, and I know you might be thinking,
YouTube art lady, how is all of this relevant to digital artists? I just want to draw my Sonic OCs making out. And you're probably right. A lot of us use very simplified visual styles. A lot of this probably just doesn't apply. But you remember that old phrase that you have to know the rules before you can break them? Stylization is breaking the rules in a way that simplifies them and makes them make sense and makes them look all pretty. So knowing these rules will help you to have a way better understanding of what you're trying to represent visually. So now that we're past all the explanation mumbo jumbo, let's try to apply what we learned and try an example where we use some shading on my character here. I'm going to try 3 different environments with 3 different light sources to show you guys how all of this actually applies.
hello friends. So I'm really going to try to do most of this first example live so that you can really see what I'm talking about. But first, let's talk brushes. When I shade in Clip Studio, I use a number of different brushes, but the main ones are firstly the G Pen. It's got a nice hard edge to it and it's so sharp you can really cut into a figure. I just really like the feel of this brush. The hard airbrush. Airbrushes are like super unappreciated because they're really great for making weak or feathered shadows and for blending out. So I use the airbrush a lot. Next up is the transparent watercolor brush, and this is probably my favorite brush in all of Clip Studio Paint because you can create both hard and soft edges with it. I probably use this one the most for painting and shading. Sometimes I also use this dense watercolor brush. It's similar to the transparent watercolor brush in the G Pen because it's got like a little bit of tapering here. It also has a very hard edge to it. And finally, for blending, I like to use the blend tool. It can create hard and soft edges. It basically moves around the color that I already have down on the canvas. It is fantastic.
It's also important to note that I am using an old version of Clip Studio Paint here, but you can can download all these brushes from their website. Link will be in the description.
So for this first demo, I've prepared just a little headshot of my character Quintessa and a couple of different backgrounds so that we can practice a few different lighting scenarios. Now, I've just done some very basic coloring on most parts of this, but then you can see the face has got some kind of painterly shading going on. I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial because I'm planning on making a dedicated tutorial for how I do face shading, but this is just the kind of shading that you might have on a 3D character model just to give it some depth before you even light the model at all. So I'm basically using that same method here. All of the lighting that I'm going to do is going to go on top of this already slightly painted character. And I like to do this painting layer on just my flat color layer over here so that this doesn't get affected by all of the other shading. So let's say in this first example, Quintessa is lit by the sun on the top left corner of our canvas. It's afternoon, we got bright sunlight coming in here and it's just hitting all over the place. We've got like basically just one light source. But if you're in an outdoor environment, you also have all of this ambient light up here in the sky and all this bounce light that's going to be reflecting off the grass and all of this stuff. So all this blue light is also going to be cast down into the shadows of our character, and then we're also going to have a little bit of ambient lighting coming up from the ground. It's going to be very random, so we don't have to really even be precise about it, but in a lighting scenario like this is not going to be your only light source. You're also going to have all this environmental light affecting your character. So when I shade digitally, for the most part, I just take my color layer here, which is locked, and then I put a new layer on top of that, and then I do a clipping mask so that anything drawn in this layer stays locked to the bottom layer. And then what I'm going to do is set this top layer to multiply so that if I have a dark color, it appears really dark and it has a bit of a blend mode effect with colors on the layer below it. So when we shade a character like this, we're not actually indicating this light that would be hitting the character at all these angles. This would be sort of the actual light falling on the character. But we're not really doing that, are we? Instead, when I shade, I'm more going to be shading negative space, the area that the light is not going to be touching, because on this color layer I have colored things the way they would be lit if there was light falling on it. So what we're going to be focusing on is all this negative space. And I'm generally going to be using this cell shading method, but instead of just flat cell shading, it's actually going to be blended in a little bit where the light feathers out. I'm going to take my blend tool and I'm going to blend it out according to the forms of my character. So first things first, I want to choose a color that this light is going to be. You don't want to shade something with just flat black. You want to pick a color for your shading to have. And in an outdoor lighting situation like this, a good rule of thumb to have is warm light, cool shadows. That's a classic Ross Draws tip. So if we have all this warm light coming in at this direction, we could generally come over here and pick an opposite color to shade with, and it's going to end up looking pretty good. I'm just going to take this blue color and start shading anywhere where I don't think light is going to be hitting. So on the other edge of this nose, on the corner of the mouth here, underneath the lips, and then it's going to be wrapping around the form to the chin, probably around here. And once we get into these areas that are kind of deep and not much light is going to be hitting them at all, we're definitely going to have a lot of shadow falling here. This hair is going to be casting a shadow. The higher the angle of the sun, the longer the angle of the shadow. So if the sun is coming from way up here, we're going to have longer shadows cast down here. That also goes for stuff like the nose, the brow, little bits of hair. Even at this angle of the sun, you're probably going to have a little bit of lighting peeking through here, so I'm actually going to have a little bit of a lit spot on the cheek here. The rest of this little area is going to be in shadow. Chin is casting a bit of a shadow down, but maybe the sun catches the little bits of hair at the end here. Then the hair casts a little bit of a shadow down. As you can see, not a lot of this has to be completely precise. It's an artistic interpretation. The more you're sort of taking into account what the sun and what the light is actually doing, the more realistic it's going to look. Also going to have these little areas in here that are so deep between other objects but they barely have any light being cast back into them. So those areas are going to be really in dark, deep shadow. Sometimes I'll like to even depict those areas with my line art and my underpainting. Like you can see I've got a little bit of a shadow right here on the line art and right here. I wouldn't imagine that any light is being cast back up into these little shadows. I make a darker mark in those areas as well as that little bit under the chin. This is definitely artistic interpretation, but it can actually add a lot of depth to your illustration, so I like doing little things like this. Borrows a lot of principles from like old ink drawings and the way people ink in anime as well. Alright, now here we've got a pretty good first rough pass of the shading. Now you might be thinking this is looking very messy and pretty ugly and not that great. And that's because whenever I do this first pass of shading, I like to do it pretty rough and messy because I don't leave my shading just hard edged like this. Next step is to go in with my blend tool and start blending out some of these shadows and wrapping them around the form the way they actually would in real life. See some of these scraggly bits like here and here and here where it just looks like I wasn't very careful about how I was laying down the color? Well, the reason for that is that this little blend tool with these settings can kind of just move color around that you already have down. I basically just lay color down so that I can then move it around later and put it where I want it to go, essentially. I feel like these two little shadows that I just put down are a pretty good example of how I do things. See how this shadow has this sort of hard dark edge and this very light feathered edge? A lot of shadows are going to have a hard edge and a soft edge where it's sort of blended out and feathered away. So when light hits a plane like it does here, this is a pretty hard edge. The further away this next edge is from this shadow, less intense and more feathered it's gonna get. So I tend to blend those out a little bit. When I blend things out, I'm going to blend a little bit here and under here. I'm going to blend this down, blend this out. I'm going to blend these out so it's a little bit less harsh. I'm going to blend around this plane at the bottom of the lip and around these planes on the chin. You might find this to be a little bit tricky at first, and I promise it's going to get more intuitive the longer you do it and the more shadows. But the key idea here is that not all shadows are going to be at the same strength and intensity. So that's what this blend step is doing. It's sort of taking these shadows I've laid down that are at all the same intensity and lowering the intensity for some of them. Sometimes I'll take my airbrush tool and set it to like an eraser, just even erase away some shadows that I think are a little bit too intense. Then a lot of this is also just done with my blend tool. You can see with a lot of these, I'm having hard edge, soft shadow. A lot of these I'm just blending away one edge of a hard shadow that I've created. You can also do this a bunch of different ways according to what your art style is. This is also definitely being affected by my art style and the way that I like to do things. You might have a different method. I really like this style of shading and blending because it really caters to a bunch of different art styles, and it also takes into account a lot of shape language principles, which are also very cool. I like a lot of these sort of shapes in my art. These sort of like rounded, boxy, sharp shapes. They have an edge, but instead of the edge being like a sharp triangle, a lot of the times it's more like a rounded sort of square edge. This hair is casting a shadow. It's probably going to get pretty weak because hair is just not that dense of an object. The shadow is definitely going to be sneaking up in there. Method is especially good for clothing because you can kind of mimic the way shadows will go deep into a clothing fold or be really soft on the edges of a clothing fold. It also brings some nice little brush strokes into your art, which I think is fantastic. It makes it feel more artistic, more painterly. It gives it like an extra layer of art style instead of being all like hard, blocky edges, which there's nothing wrong with that. I just tend to favor that sort of painterly look for my art personally. Another thing I'll sometimes do is create another multiply layer on top of my other multiply layer and just go in with the same color as the other shading layer and the airbrush tool just darken up the other side of my subject a little bit, just to add like an overall favored lit edge and then a darker edge to my character. And now we've got a shaded character, but it is very, very intense shading. This is a little bit too much. So what I'll do next is go to my multiply layer and just mess around with the opacity until I find what works. I think around 50 or 55% works pretty well for this illustration. So next, I'm going to lock it. This is where a lot of the bounce lighting and some of the subsurface scattering stuff comes in. I'm gonna take a lighter blue color to mimic the sky and a lot of the surrounding light. We're gonna just work a little bit of that up into our shadows. And then on top of that, I'm going to take sort of like a warm orangey color, then start taking the edge of my shadows and coloring the edges with this color. This sort of helps to mimic that subsurface scattering look, especially on the skin. I have a lot of it on the nose here, a bit underneath the chin. And then a lot on the edges here. It just helps to add a little bit more dimension to the shadows instead of just having like one flat color going on. Sometimes I'll even throw in another overlay layer on top with sort of like a pinky orange tone and do the same thing with a lot of the shadows, just to add in some vibrancy and intensity. And if I have a really bright light source, I'll also do the same thing I did with dark side, but in reverse, use an overlay layer to have like a very vibrantly lit side. And I'll mess around a bit with the intensity of that layer to get it about where I think it would be. For the sake of keeping things simple today, I'm not going to go too in-depth into this step. My last step of shading a character before messing around with more of the lighting elements is basically to do a bit of a paint overpass where I take any shadows that aren't quite what I want them to be, and instead of messing with the actual shading layers, I just go in and paint over them a little bit. Actually physically get them where I want them to be. This really helps for adding like depth and intensity like on the face. These eyeshadows just aren't quite what I want, so instead of going in and messing with the layers and having to deal with the effect that blend modes has on your layers, I'm just going in quite literally messing with the colors by painting them. Of course, to do this bit, it helps to have a knowledge of painting under your belt. You can't really do this if you don't know how to do at least a little bit of basic skin and character painting. So I recommend trying to brush up on that a little bit if you want to bring this style into your shading. But in my opinion, it brings a lot of life to my illustrations. I don't think that my illustrations would really be what I want them to be without this step. And I remember before I started adding this step in my process, I was much less satisfied with the stuff that I was coming up with. I think with digital art, since this step is pretty simple, it really helps to use it so that you use all of the tools at your disposal. Even though painting can be pretty tricky and intimidating, I think it's worth it. I think this step adds a lot to a little character illustration like this. If you're doing a lot of painting, those first few steps might seem a little bit wasteful, but they actually lay out where all of our light and shadows are going to go, and they also give us colors to work with, so you could just go straight in and paint your character. I like to do all of the lighting stuff first so that I kind of have a guide for what I'm doing. You can see I'm just adding a lot of reds and warm colors to the edges of these cool shadows. Without this, I think the skin would look a lot flatter and much more plasticky. And adding little bright highlights to like the nose and the forehead and the cheeks also help to do a lot. Another thing I like to do is add like a lighter blue into the blue shadows and then have like a darker edge here. I think the contrast alone pretty much sells that there's a shadow, so having this brighter blue in there just adds more dimension and it just adds more color to the piece as well. I think it makes it look very pretty and appealing. A lot of my style whenever it comes to lighting and shading is having like a shape with an edge that's sort of one color and then another color sort of within that shape. Like you can see a perfect example of this going on right here. You have edges that are sort of red, and then within the shape you have more blue lighting. And that's a perfect example of also bounce light coming in. You have blue light from the environment bouncing into the shadow. I also like to use this airbrush to add a little bit of airbrushy dimension to things. Don't underestimate your airbrush. It is a wonderful tool. The airbrush is definitely underrated whenever it comes to digital art. Then on this side of the nose and like deep within the nose, we're going to be getting those deep dark red shadows. Another thing you want to be careful about whenever you're doing a painting technique or a shading technique like this is not to overblend. I think a lot of beginners feel the need to like blend everything out and make sure that it is just so smooth. But you can see a lot of this is only very roughly blended in with just a couple paint strokes actually doing the blending work. You don't need a lot if you have the right brush settings going. And I have my brush settings in this video, so if you want to try it out, practice getting some blend strokes. Like this little line right here I just stuck in, I'm just going to do like 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the only blending that I'm probably going to do with that little section. You don't need a lot to blend things out and make them look nice. I'll also add in these like really dark, high contrast areas and bits like behind her ears and these little sections here. I don't imagine much light at all is getting in there. So I'll almost do another little shading pass, but on my paint layer and just really darken those up. And another thing I'll do is I want to bring a little bit more warmth into the hair and these shadow areas. So I'll do the same thing we've been doing. I'll just put a little bit of color onto the inside of these shadows. Show that this is still red hair, it's still got some vibrancy and saturation to it, but it is in shadow. You'll have this little edge here indicating the shadow. Muddy shadows are very easy to do with some of these digital tools, especially the multiply layer. It doesn't always do exactly what you want it to do. So this step is great because you can go back in and sort of add some stuff that you've been missing. For bits like this that are basically just gold, I typically go all out and just paint these the way I would paint like a metal object. And again, I'm just going in and adding like a bright edge to some of these clothing fold shadows, or a highlight to sort of a central point where there's like a fold. Then I'm just going to go in and blend all this out. I use a pretty big brush for this. Just a couple of strokes to blend it out, not overdoing it. Still want to have some messiness in there. Now, last step before we get to the fun part, I'm going to go in and add sort of blue hue into these shadows over here. Once again, just to mimic some bounce light, bring some of the atmosphere into the character. These bits are just going to live right inside of these shadow shapes. Right now I feel like this blue is looking a little bit too intense, too saturated, so I'm going to bring it down to the green side, lock my layer, actually blend some of these back in. I want them to be subtle. I feel like that's a pretty good level of subtlety. Then I'll just deepen a couple of these shadows here. These brown straps are probably a little bit reflective too, so I'm just going to add a little bit of a warm highlight on top of here as well. Alright, I could literally work at this all day. Part of being a painter and an artist is, quite honestly, knowing when to stop. If I was making this to be an actual piece that I would put out and post on Instagram, then I would probably work on it a little bit longer. But for this example, let's just go ahead and get to the fun part. And the fun part for me is adding edge light or rim light. Now in this example, you probably wouldn't be getting a whole lot of edge light or rim light because edge light and rim light normally happen when light source is more like behind your character and you have bits picking up from behind. You've got like this sort of going on. But I think that edge light brings so much to a piece, so I don't really care. I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna start messing around and bringing some light to the edges of my character. We'd definitely be getting some here. Definitely catching the light on this hair. Further away we get from the light source, the less pronounced it gets, so we're gonna have more subtlety over on this side. Bunch on this ear and on her temple. A little bit is falling in here. I don't know if this is even so much edge light as it is just cast light that's falling on my character, but I normally like to use it as edge light and give like really crisp, bold light sections. Right now I'm just kind of blocking things in. Oh. Now this character looks like plastic, so the next step is to go in and blend some of this out. Same exact method I used for the shading and blend out. Give it sort of a hard edge and a soft edge. Look at that, our character already looks glowy. So I'm gonna put this probably on like an overlay layer and gonna duplicate it. Put this on maybe a normal. Basically the same thing we already did on the face. Add some warmth. And then I'll just mess around with these layers until I sort of get them to where I want it to be. Play around with some of the blend modes. I think overlay works pretty good with this. And maybe I'll take my brush and just sort of do some of this nonsense. And then I also love to add a little bit of blue rim light as well, just to get that opposite side sort of where it needs to be, just to indicate that there's also sort of bounce light bouncing up onto the edges of this character. A lot of these techniques are just here to help my character feel grounded in a scene. A lot of it is quite exaggerated. That's okay, because this is art, we're taking artistic liberties, we're having fun, and stylizing things. And there for the memes, we're gonna put the highlight on the hair here. The reason for that is that the hair is actually arcing up in this area. So you're gonna get a highlight on where the hair arcs, because that is the area of the hair that is reflective. And sometimes maybe I'll mess around, put a whole overlay layer over everything and do my two colors like this just to grain the character in the scene, something like that. Mess with the opacity. There you go. Example 1, basically finished. This isn't quite to the level of polish that I would make it if it was really like a full-on illustration, but I hope that this gave you a pretty good idea of what I do and how I go about shading something like this. So now let's do a couple of other examples with different lighting scenarios so that you can see how I handle light that isn't just the default daylight scene from top left, because I feel like this is what literally everyone does. But I wanted to start with something simple so that you guys don't get confused. So in this next example, the lighting is top down. It's a bright, sunny day, about high noon. So a lot of the light is going to be hitting the top of her head, the tip of her nose, her cheekbones, and hitting certain areas of her outfit. So her eye sockets, under her nose, the bottom of her face, and under her chin are going to be in shadow because the light is being cast at a direct downward angle. I'm doing these examples the exact same way I did the first one. I'm beginning with hard cell shading in an indigo color because it's the most opposite to the color of the light. And I'm not going too crazy about being precise. I'm just trying to capture the main areas that would be in shadow. And of course, once I'm done with the first cell shading pass, I lower the opacity of my multiply layer and do a bit of erasing in areas that I think would be catching more light. So the cheeks and the sides of the collar. And then I go in with my blend tool and blend the edges where I think the shadows would be a bit softer. So I have sharper shadows directly under the eye sockets, and then they get a little softer as they cascade down the cheekbones. There's also quite a bit of feathering on the clothing folds. And now I'm going in and adding some of that bounce light or core lighting to my multiply layer. I'm adding more purple hues because I feel like it goes well with this background. And since my process isn't entirely linear when I shade, you'll see me work in some paint over passes here and there. I add a bit of blue tone to the edges of the shadows on the cloak, and then I add some warm light to the edges of the shadows on the face, hair, and to the edge of the character on my multiply layer, just to really give the impression of strong daylight. You'd probably get a good bit of that subsurface light on the ears and bright daylight example like this, so I add some pretty saturated red tones there, and as I'm doing this, you can really tell that the character is starting to get ingrained in the scene. The colors of the light are meshing well with the colors of the light hitting the rocks in the background, and that's really what I'm going for. Now I'm just doing a bit more painting over, just adjusting the color of the light where it hits the cloak to be a bit more accurate to the scene. I do a couple overlay layers to bring some more purple tones into the piece. I do a lot of tweaking with the blend mode layers as I go in pieces like this if I want to bring some different colors into the lighting. And now I'm just adding a bit of blue edge light just to hint at all the blue ambient light that would be cast around in this scene. Again, this is a bit of a stylistic choice, but I like doing it. It pairs well with the fantasy settings of my work. And I'm just adding a bit of that blue light everywhere light would be hitting to add some intensity. I feel like around or before noon, light has a bright, clear glow, so I'm just trying to capture that with the blue. And when I shade, it's never the exact same process every time. There's a lot of tweaking depending on the scene. So here I'm just making a lot of judgment calls. Trust your judgment and your artistic eye when you're shading, because it's all with just style. As is art, there are no real rules. Just add what you feel a piece needs. And here I feel like the light needs some more tweaks, so I'm just painting some purple into the shadows of the clothing. And then I felt like too much of the cloak was in shadow, so I'm going in and painting more light into it. That's one thing I love about this painting method. It saves, at least me personally, time. You don't have to go back and tweak all of your blend mode layers. You just color pick and add the colors on top. And now you can see me adding bounce light up into the shadows of the collar there, those warm purple tones and hues coming in, and onto the belt and buckle as well. There's a highlight on the bottom of the buckle that's reflecting from the light spot below. That's always a fun touch to add. Trying to get the eyes right is also very important for a piece like this. You can see that most of her eyes are in shadow, but then there's some highlights around the tear ducts in the center of her eyes. And then to finish things up, I'm just doing a few more passes of warm light and then adding another rim light layer, this time using the color of the bright yellow light that's lighting the scene. As you can see, as soon as I add this in and adjust the opacity, Quintessa immediately looks like she's more a part of the scene. And now it's really just all finishing touches, adding a few more overall light layers, airbrushing here and there, painting over a bit more as I see tweaks. And finally, I'm just going in and coloring the outside edge of the line art a bright yellow. Normally I do this with rim light, but I liked how coloring the line art looked better here. And this is more of a background thing, but then I just added a cast of light over the top of the canvas to make the light look very intense. And here is the outcome. For this final demo, I decided to do a bit more of a fun one. For this example, there's going to basically be two general light sources lighting our character. We have some light that's backlighting her, so we'll get to play around with some rim light. But then I had the concept that some light is being cast on her face from below by light reflecting up at her off the water. Maybe there's magic glowing water, I don't know, it just seemed cool. So again, I'm just starting off with a pass of a hard cell shading layer, remembering that a lot of the light in the scene is actually being cast from behind her at an upper angle. So lots of light wrapping around the edges, less light inside the silhouette. I'm probably taking a few liberties with how I'm having light hit the side of her face, but it really makes the shot look dramatic. You can see I'm leaving the bottom of her mouth and under her nose out of shadow because that's where the light from below would be hitting. I'm also leaving bits of her hair and cloak out of shadow because I'm planning on having them catch the light as well. I'm kind of just loosely blocking things in right now because a lot of the light coming from below is actually going to be more subtle in the final result. I'm trying to figure out which planes are facing downward because those planes are the ones that would be catching the light coming from below. Now my next step is to begin blending everything out, of course. I'm also erasing away a bit with my hard airbrush and G pen. I'm slowly finding the areas that I think light would be catching a little bit. Again, this is illustration, so we can take some liberties. Once I lower the opacity, I really begin to see how the light is taking shape, so I'm able to go in and tweak some stuff. I'm erasing and blending a lot around the jaw and the mouth because that's where a lot of this light would probably be cast. Already it looks a bit like someone's shining a flashlight up at her face. That's the effect we're going for. And now I'm just doing a coloring pass on my multiply layer, adding in some of the warmth to the edges of my character. Sometimes this step takes a few tries. It's great to try out a couple of different ideas to see what works. And now I'm starting to go in and do some of that painting. I love how much control this step gives me because I can really get everything where I want it to be. I'm adding darker hues and values to the shadows of the face and then brighter values and hues to areas of the face that are in light. And I'm just painting in some adjustments as I see them. I'm adding some darker shadows to the cloak and clothing, especially near the edges of the shadow areas. You can see me zoom out here a lot to make sure the light reads well as a thumbnail. This is a really good practice for making art readable in general. As I keep painting here, I'm adding more and more contrast, darker shadows, brighter highlights, and it's starting to have a pretty dramatic effect on the lighting. Once I start to paint in some of the darker bits of the hair, the character is really starting to look bottom lit. Then I just do a quick airbrush pass on an overlay layer to add some intensity to the backlight, and I'm adding in more details to everything, more detail to the hair, more detail to her hair clips, and I also tweak the lighting in the eyes a little bit because it wasn't looking quite right. And now we're really on to finishing touches. Similarly Similarly to my previous example, I'm doing a lot of overlay layers, trying to get the saturation of the light to be brighter and more intense. I really like light to pop. And I'm coloring the outer edge of the line art once again because she's backlit. And finally, I'm just adding a blue cast light to the bottom of the art just to help sell that glowy bottom lid effect I'm going for. And there we go. The third example is done. Now these were pretty small scale examples, all things considered, so I think we need to do a bigger piece, but first we need to build on these lighting and shading principles a bit because art is about more than technicality.
A good knowledge of shading and lighting is not only practical for when you want to draw pretty pictures of your Sonic OCs making out, but it is also incredibly valuable for when you want to have that good storytelling in your work. This is where we welcome special guest star Color Theory to the video. Yay! Dramatic or moody lighting in an illustration can turn something relatively mundane like this into something with a lot of character like this. Some of this is achieved with moody lighting angles and dramatic shadows,
but a lot of the mood of lighting and of your piece can be communicated through things like color temperature, color contrast, and color symbolism. Warm colors like pinks, reds, oranges, and yellows can create anywhere from a soft, pleasant atmosphere to a decaying or dangerous one, while greens, light blues, deep blues, and purples can create the imagery of a lush forest, a serene waterfront, or a cold and uneasy landscape. Colors have psychology attached to them, and you can use that psychology as a tool in your art to communicate emotion.
So now I'm going to take everything we've learned and do a shading demo on a character piece that I've been working on and show you how lighting and shading can dramatically affect the emotion of a piece and show you my full shading process. Once again, I'll do most of this first one live and then move into time lapse for the other two, so we're not here for like 5 years.
Obviously, shading and lighting on just a headshot is one thing, but a bigger piece like this can be a lot more intimidating to shade. You have way more going on. You even have lighting coming in here from a couple of different directions. You got more bounce lighting, you've got reflections, you've got metallic surfaces. There's just generally a lot more to worry about here. So that's why I'm showing you guys a bigger example, and as much as possible, I'm also going to try to do a lot of this live. Anyways, the first tip I have for you guys, we're doing an illustration of any kind really that's going to have a background, is to do the background first and to also light the background first. Notice I have all of this lighting coming in here. I've got like reflections, I've got bounce light. The lighting in this scene is set up. You want the lighting to be set up or you actually go and try to shade your characters, because otherwise you have no idea what the lighting is going to be. Notice a lot of newer, less experienced artists, even myself included back in the day, used to do their characters first and then even shade their characters and then add a background. You just don't know what your lighting situation is going to be. It's objectively harder to do it that way. I know backgrounds are difficult, but start with a background. And whenever I do something like this, I generally use the same exact method that I used on the smaller headshot example. I have color that's sort of opposite tone as the light source on a multiply layer, and then I just go in basically at full opacity and start cutting into the character and shading with just basic hard edge cell shading. Sometimes I'll go in and also start blending and feathering, but for the sake of this example, I'm going to try to do hard cell shading first, just so that it's less confusing. The goal is to pay attention to where these light rays would be hitting the character here. So you're going to be having light on the shoulder, on his chest here, on here, but then you're probably going to have some of this light cut off here by his arm and by the sword. It's important to know where the light is hitting so that you know where the light wouldn't be hitting. So you have light hitting all around here. Then the rest of this is generally going to be in shadow. So that's what I'm going to go in and shade first. He's slouching over, so maybe you've got some clothing folds going on here. Got the color casting a shadow down here. This little ridge on the shoulder armor is going to cause a shadow. All this leg area is going to be in shadow here. Then we have the top of this leg, which is probably going to be catching at least a little bit of light. So I have a shape here that indicates that. Maybe just the top of his hand here is catching some of that light coming through. The hand is in shadow. This is in shadow. If you're really new to this and you're learning, getting reference photos is also really great. I'm not using reference photo here just because this lighting scenario is very specific. But if you want to learn, an excellent way to do that is to do just a lighting study. Draw a character or something that you want to draw, pose or a lighting scenario that is similar to your reference, and then just copy the lighting in your reference and try to emulate it. It's a really good way to practice without getting bogged down by doing just study after study, and it also helps you to be able to apply it to a slightly different situation. That way you're not just completely blindly copying a reference. Then you still have something to go on for the lighting scenario that you're trying to work with. I know faces are really tricky, but they can be really important for an illustration. So I'm going to show you guys this in a little bit more detail. This lighting is very similar to the first example that we did live. You can kind of see this same lighting scenario in action. Of course, it's lighting up the left side of his face, and then the right side of his face is probably going to catch a little bit of light right there. Lip is going to be in shadow. A bit of his bottom lip, and it's going to wrap around his chin about like that. Then I'm going to leave part of his jawline in here unshaded, just a hint that maybe it's catching a little bit of bounce lighting. It's happening over in this direction. I'm leaving just the edges of his little bits of hair out because I figure they're catching some light. I'm doing the same for the back of his head as well because I think maybe some light from this other direction is coming in and catching there. And his ear is a little bit in shadow. This is in shadow a little bit here. Of his lid maybe. Sometimes I'll use more of an erase away shading method if I find areas like this where I'm like a little bit more light would be getting in there. Eraser is a really good tool to put on a hotkey, so if you have situations like this where you need to switch between this and a brush, you can do it really quickly. There you go, there's some very rough shading on Eugene. But now we're gonna move over to Rose, and she's a little trickier because she's got all this hair and she's got armor, but it is gonna be mostly the same thing. Armor can definitely be really fun to shade, but it can also be tricky because whenever you have a metallic surface, you have to be careful about how you shade it, that it doesn't end up looking too flat or plasticky or too chromed out and reflective. Honestly, I don't personally think that looks too good unless that's exactly what you're going for. A lot of this stuff is going to be in shadow for our first pass here. And you do have some light coming through. Her leg is open. We also have some light sneaking onto the top of her knee here. A lot of this knee is actually going to be in shadow because it's down here in this area. It doesn't have much light even hitting it. We also have to take into account this piece of fabric here. This is her cloak, so it's actually going to be obscuring any light that would be hitting her shoe here. Just haven't fully shaded this cloak yet. So Rose in this example is pretty fun because you're gonna have a lot of light hitting from the front direction, like over here, but then also some coming in from the back direction, and it's going to be catching on her hair here. So we have to take that into account as well. We'd probably be catching a little bit on the back of her armor here. It's going to be hitting the elbow, and then this little piece of plate armor, and the edge of this armor as well. Some of it's going to be obscured by his arm, so we'll have a bit of a shadow coming in here. And we'll have a bit of a shadow coming in here because her arm is blocking it. But then some light from this direction is going to be falling on this part of the arm. So we'll have some light coming in here, hitting her thumb. But then all this is going to be pretty obscured. But then once we get to the other side of the book, we're going to have a little bit of light hitting here, probably a bit on the spine. Hair like this is definitely tricky to shade, but I kind of just shade in places that are really deep between hairs. Like here, I'll put a little bit of a mark and shade it over to here. This is a couple of different hairs. Just anywhere that's probably going to be kind of in deeper shadow. Try to go with the flow of the hair as well. You're probably going to have more of a shadow. No light is really going to be hitting this part directly. And over here, you're probably going to have some light from this direction hitting. Again, I'm sort of making this part of the hair pretty backlit, as if some light from the left direction is hitting the back of the hair. It may or may not in this lighting scenario, but I think that sort of thing looks nice, so even if it's taking liberties a little bit, I'm going to do it as sort of stick choice. I'm shading hair, I don't want to have too many visible strands of hair like I do here, but I do like to do this in a couple of places just so that you can kind of get a feel for the fact that hair and not just static shapes. I kind of like the idea of some of the hairs casting a shadow onto the armor. I feel like it'll add a little bit of a nice touch. Armor on her chest here is a little bit rounded, so then you follow that plane. This would all kind of just be in shadow here because covered up by part of hair. Whenever you're shading curly or wavy hair like this, you have to remember you're gonna have a ridge like this whenever the curl kind of pops up. That's the ridge that's reflect the light. So whenever you have places in shadow, it's gonna be like this area. See how you're gonna have shadow here and then more of a highlight whenever it gets up to the ridge. Basically the same deal as Eugene, but like mirrored, right? Cheekbone's kind of gonna follow this profile. All this is gonna be in shadow. Her nose ridge is gonna fall about here. Be a shadow under her nose here. This is gonna be partially in shadow. And then her nose ridge is going to be casting a shadow this direction. Probably not a huge shadow. So this area is probably gonna look something like that. Side of her lip is going to be a bit in shadow on the bottom. This little guy is going to be casting a bit of a shadow down here. And then when we get up to about here, her hair is probably starting to catch the light a little. Maybe something like that. And when we get done with the initial shading layer, it's probably going to look something like this. So the next step is to just start blending things all out, and I'm going to do this the exact same way I did it in the other example. Just anytime there's a shadow that I think feathers, I'm going to just blend it out a little bit, and this is going to happen especially to shadows that are far away from the object that is casting the shadow. So let's do this for example. I have this little belt here. When it's close to the belt, it's going to be dark because it's close to what's casting the shadow. As it moves further away, gonna have a little bit more feathering happening because environmental light is getting in that area, and then it is also further away from the object casting the shadow. Same thing maybe up here. Maybe add a bit of a soft shadow coming in here. I do this by maybe adding an edge, just blending it out. I'm gonna be having it over here. See how much more convincing the lighting is already getting just as I'm sort of blending out these shadows and making it so that not all the shadows are at the same exact intensity. That'll probably blend out. That'll probably blend out. Certainly some of this stuff in here. You want to blend this out kind of along the plane that it is cast on. So this blends out sort of in this direction. This goes along the edge of the bicep. This goes along the edge of the forearm. This is going to follow the contour of the knee. Maybe blends more this direction. To make this really work and look nice, you do have to understand form. You gotta think about whatever you're shading in terms of 3D space, not as a flat 2D illustration. Already the shadows on Eugene are looking a lot less harsh, so let's go in and do just the exact same thing for Rose. And there we go. Once we're done with this step, this is when I normally will start to go in and figure out where I want the opacity of this multiply layer to be. I'd say right around 50% is probably pretty good, maybe a little higher. And again, I'm gonna lock that layer and then just go in and start adding a little bit of warm light to the edges of these shadows. I'm going to use sort of like a warm pinky color to match the color of the sunlight coming in. I'm not going to do it everywhere, just on areas where I think some of that light scattering might happen. So especially like on skin, on the face here, on the hand here. I also really love to do this for hair. I don't know if it's like the most accurate thing, but I think it makes all of these like little highlights and glowy spots look a lot more vibrant. Edge and reflection of armor is also fun to do just because shadows on reflections tend to have a little bit more dimension than normal shadows. Just acts as kind of a nice warm light wrap also, especially in areas like this. Look at that. Do the same with the shadows on Rose's face. I feel like this already has our characters sort of set in the world. If you're happy with this kind of shading, you could even stop here. But since my style is very painterly and I like to do a lot with the shading and lighting step, I'm going to go in with some time lapse and do a paint over of this like I did with the previous example. Okay, so I'm a big dum-dum, you guys, because I forgot to press record for most of the painting process on this first example, and that's kind of a huge disservice to all of you, because this is kind of the moment you've been waiting for, and painting in this piece is like the majority of the process. Anyways, I'm sorry, we'll see more painting in the next two, but to quickly recap, I've been painting everything, just like in the other examples, but on a larger scale. The shading we've already laid down gave me a really good base of colors to work with. So the formula here is basically color picking and adjusting to darker colors to add in darker shadows within the overall cell shaded shadow, and then color picking and shifting the color slightly lighter, warmer, more saturated, etc. for highlights and especially the reflections on the armor. In big color blocks of shadow, like on the coattails of Eugene's tunic, I'm adding in a bit of a brighter, more saturated color to indicate that it's draping over the fountain they're sitting on. This is like a really huge element of my painting style. I'll have a shadow, and then I'll add some different color variation within that shadow to mimic bounce light, whatever light's in my environment, just to make things look a lot more interesting. And of course, also like in the example with the coattails, to indicate a change in plane or form. You can also see me working on painting Rose's face a bit here. I'm really just adding a lot of blending to the shadows and some intensity to the light hitting her face, and then tonality to the areas that are in shadow. There's dimension to a head, so I'm adding some blue bounce light to her temple and cheekbone to show that the plane is facing a different direction, and I'm adding some warmth to her cheeks and some contour to her cheekbones. I'm adding some darker tones below her nose and correcting some of the highlights. I'm just trying to add a lot more dimension than what a cell shading layer allows you to do. You can see me adding in some dark shadows between clumps of hair where things would be getting pretty dark. Thankfully, you can still see me painting in some reflections on the armor. A lot of this is just guesswork, really. I add a darker bit of color along the plane of the armor to indicate something off camera is dark and reflecting into the armor, and I'm doing the opposite for the highlights. I choose lighter colors to indicate some light being cast. I don't want it to look too chromed out, so this less precise method actually works pretty well for that. For planes facing shadow, like the armor on her right thigh, I choose cooler tone colors like blues and purples to paint the armor. I like to add a darker streak of reflection and place it next to a lighter streak and blend where I think it needs it. Highlights will, of course, mostly occur on the ridge of a curved surface, so a lot of my highlights are following the forms, so that adds a lot of depth to the armor. And if I have something close to the surface of the armor, like the hair, I'll add some subtle highlights and reflections for that. And then I'm also adding bits of color here and there to imply the environment is being reflected into the armor. Reds from the cloak, some tan light being reflected off the fountain onto the thigh armor, and bits of the books reflected into the thigh armor there as well. And here we have the absolute finishing touches of an illustration. With painting, you can really go in and add detail for a while. I spend a lot of time with my illustrations, just building up layers of detail. So much of this is just painting in and tweaking and trying to define forms and edges and show which direction everything is facing, and then I'll notice an area isn't dark enough, or I'll find an area of shadow and I'm like, oh, I kind of want to add like a color inside the area of that shadow. So that's what a lot of this is. And of course, it's adding more detail in general, adding more paint strokes, just trying to make the illustration have more character and more depth. I really like this part because it can just go on for a long time and I can really kind of use my imagination and just really indulge in what my art style is, which is like organized chaos. But I have a really fun time with this. I hope that this is a decent explanation of my shading style for you guys. Like, you really just have to understand the light and the shading and how shadows work because you're a different artist. Your art style is going to be different than this. So if you do want to kind of emulate what I'm doing here, I hope that I've explained at least the painting portion well enough so that you can go in and apply it to your own work and sort of have something similar, but something that's uniquely yours, because you shouldn't just have to straight up copy my art style because it's fallible, it's not perfect, I'm still learning myself. But if you're curious about how I've done this whole painting thing for a while, I hope this goes into a little bit more depth with it. But near the end, I'm just kind of, again, all over the place. A lot of this is adding in some background elements that I even forgot to add in the first place. So adding some water, adding in some darkness to the trees and leaves behind them, just painting the fountain a little bit, and just kind of trying to make the illustration look cohesive and nice because, you know, even though this is an example for an art video, I still want it to look pretty good and pretty cool. I know this is kind of getting away from like character painting at this point, but I hope you can see in these parts at least that I actually paint backgrounds in a very similar way. Painting for me is kind of all just painting. So like you could see me earlier a couple seconds ago, I'm sort of defining the edges of the fountain the same way, and I'm sort of using the principles of lost edges a lot here as well. So I hope this gives you a decent idea of how I use like hard edges, soft edges, and lost edges like everywhere in my work, certainly with shading and painting, but also just for backgrounds for everything that I'm doing basically. And that's also why I encourage you to try to learn some painting techniques if you don't already know them, because even if you don't do painterly shading, they're gonna help you out with your backgrounds and for all of the other aspects of your art because they just give you a better understanding of illustration overall. So to switch up the colors and the mood of the lighting, for this second example, we're going for a night scene. The lighting angles are similar, but we'll be tweaking that a bit. And to change my colors, I'm just going to be using the color balance sliders. I'm adding more blue and purple tones to kind of bring a serene, royal, but cold atmosphere. Eugene is a prince in this story and comes from a very wealthy, lavish kingdom. So I think cold royal colors would do well to represent the environment where he lives. Everything is ornate and beautiful and expensive, but there's a formality, isolation, and coldness that comes from his environment. This doesn't necessarily have anything to do with shading, but that's how you can work storytelling and color symbolism into an illustration pretty effortlessly. So since this scene is at night and everything is blue, I'm just tweaking all my background layers and all my lighting to reflect that. We're not going to be seeing saturated greens or reds in this lighting. Things are going to look more teal, more magenta, so I'm changing the flat color layers to have more of a bluish hue. Color and light are relative, so that's another good reason to play around with dramatic color and lighting for your illustrations. You can learn how to make something seem like it's a certain color when the actual color identity of that object isn't even close. Like Rose's cloak and collar still look burgundy by the end, but they're not actually burgundy in this piece, they're more of like a purplish color, but the relativity of the light and color caused the viewer to interpret it as more of a red burgundy color. While I'm doing this, you can see how I address lighting and backgrounds a bit as well. I mainly handle background elements on locked layers and paint inside them. I don't use too many blend modes initially, I just paint and then try to get the form down, and then at the end I'll tweak with blend modes if I need to. If you're dealing with a scene with dramatic color and light, it's also good to figure out what color represents the darkest form of that light and lightest form of that light. For this, the darkest form of the light is a dark indigo and the lightest version is like a warm lavender, but a lot of the midtones land pretty firmly in the royal blue family. I like doing this because it adds a lot more vibrance than the alternative, which is just using a lighter blue and darker blue as my lightest and darkest colors. As I'm painting and tweaking, I'm trying to relight the background according to a night scheme so that we know how the characters should be lit. And then on my painting layer from the previous example, I'm just adjusting the color balance to be more blue and purple so that I can begin repainting according to the light in this scheme. So you notice how my main colors in this illustration are purple, blue, and pink, right? This is actually a pretty popular color scheme in color theory called analogous colors. So if you're new to choosing dramatic colors and need help, choosing from the tried and true schemes can help you to pick harmonious colors for an illustration. Finally, you can see me go in and actually begin altering the painting layer and adjusting the light. There isn't intense daylight shining on the characters in this example, just faint moonlight and probably some lamps in the garden, so I'm focusing on softening the shadows. Having softer shadows in a quiet scene can also help the viewer to feel the intended calmness of your piece. I'm also softening up a lot of the reflections on the armor as well as changing some of the angles. If there's less light in a piece, by extension, any reflections are going to be more subtle. I'm also darkening up some areas since it's literally darker in the scene. I'm changing the angle of the edge light in some areas, and here and there I'm also adding in some darker blue multiply layers to darken up the overall shadows of the characters in the fountain a bit. And then I'm just kind of going wild with some of the lighting effects. It's a magical garden, so I want the lighting to have a bit of a mystical quality. I'm also darkening the piece overall again with my color balance here at the end. I especially want the shadows to look pretty dark and to bring down the mids a bit here as well. You can also see me do a quick black and white filter to check my value levels. Values are very important, especially in like night or darker or lighter pieces. You really want to make sure that everything looks right because color can be deceptive. And then I do a pretty high saturation layer and erase it away just to bring a little vibrancy to certain areas. And now we are done with the second example and we're on to the third and final example. We're going in a pretty different direction for this example, just to show how much of an impact light and color can have on a piece, and how picking certain times of day, lighting scenarios, and colors can just completely change the feel of what is otherwise the same exact piece. So for this one, we're going for a snowy, cold landscape. The previous one was maybe cold in a serene way. This one is cold in more of an empty way. It has less life, and it feels even a bit negative. So I started out by doing the exact same thing from our previous example, tweaking my layers with the adjustment layers and color balance layers, and now I'm repainting my characters to make the colors feel more desaturated, almost lifeless. I'm using a lot of blue-green tones to do this because a lot of those desaturated blues and greens can really make something feel cold and lifeless. We've seen what this environment looks like in dramatic, lively lighting, but this cold, dim feeling can make it feel totally different. For this example, I'm making the reflections in the armor a lot more dull to show there's less light reflecting in general. It's an overcast day, meaning reflections are going to be much weaker. The shadows are getting painted to be weaker. And now I'm adding in some snow to really make things feel cold and icy. Choice of environment also plays a big role in what emotion a piece can feel like. So if you want it cold and empty, you might as well stick your characters in 6 feet of snow. I'm making sure the snow itself has a bit of a green tinge because this isn't pretty festive snow. It's February and we've been snowed in since November snow. Once again, I'm changing the background to suit the lighting and the scene. I'm making the leaves behind them darker and less saturated, bringing in some more of those blue-green tones, and I'm adding some snow onto those as well. As usual, nothing is really linear in my process. I go from tweaking the background, back to painting, back to adding light to everything, and really do whatever whenever it comes to mind. I wanted things to look a lot more overcast, so I'm making the sky darker and less bright. I'm also throwing in some multiply layers to darken up my characters, and some overlay layers to add some general ambient light. The light on an overcast day is really diffused, so all the shadows are a bit undefined. I didn't have time to do a full repaint of this piece, but if I was painting it as a full art piece, I'd soften up some of the shadows a bit more, just because the light source is so diffused. And then I just added some falling snow, added another dark cast on the environment, did a couple more quick tweaks, and then I was finally done with this example as well.
So, I've got my 3 different versions of this illustration now, right?
The first one is the lighting I intended when I first imagined this piece. It's bright and peaceful. You can tell it's basically golden hour and depicting a calm moment. The next one is still peaceful, but I'd say it's almost somber or sad. The characters feel more detached from each other. Maybe it takes place in the calm after a battle when they're taking a moment to let everything set in. This is aided by the heavy use of blue. Blue can either represent peacefulness or sadness. And in this final example, the environment is literally cold. We aren't getting peace or warmth. We're getting an emptiness and a little bit of depression from the scene. This is helped by the snow that I added, but the dull color palette is doing a lot of that work too. And the shadows are also softer. There's less intensity going on. The predominant colors are also very cool. The main colors are yellows and greens and blues, adding to that cool, desolate color palette.
So those few tweaks made only in the shading stage can change the entire emotional impact of the piece. That is the power of shading in color, and that is why it is so important to learn this stuff, because it gives you so much power. You can draw beautiful art. And that's basketball. Welcome to the end of the video. I really hope you guys enjoyed this shading tutorial, and I hope you learned something. A lot of the lighting stuff is very complicated to explain, and I don't know what I'm talking about a little bit, so I hope it made some sense to you guys. I'm going to try to make a skin painting tutorial as soon as I possibly can as like a companion tutorial to this one. I know a lot of you have been requesting that one, and I fully intend to do it. It's just figuring out how. Maybe getting a sponsor on it. Clip Studio Paint? Call me. And a huge thank you once again to Clip Studio Paint for sponsoring this video. And remember to check out the free trial of their software. I seriously can't recommend it enough. I don't think I will ever stop using it. And if you want to support the channel and the sleep-deprived meat sack who runs it, you can like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, you know, do the YouTube things. And also you can comment and let me know what other tutorials you guys want to see in the future. But for now, that's all. Thank you again for watching. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go and sit on an exercise ball for an undisclosed amount of time. But